Hi friends, welcome to Beautifully Bookish Bethany, where I have new videos every week about books and the geeky mom lifestyle. In today's video, I'm talking about my 12 favorite sci-fi books that I read in 2020. This is part of a series of videos where I'm talking about my favorite books across a variety of genres. I read a lot of books in 2020. In fact, this year I read more than I ever have before, 370 books, and there were some standouts among them, so I am coming to you sharing my picks of the best of different genres. In today's video, we're talking about my 12 favorite sci-fi books that I read this year. This is primarily adult science fiction, but I do think I have 2 YA books on this list. With that said, let's go ahead and dive in with number 12. Coming in at number 12 is The Extraordinaries by TJ Klune. This is his first YA book that came out through Torteen, and I really enjoyed it a lot. It's got kind of a sci-fi superhero thing going on. The main character is a gay teen boy with ADHD. It is own voices for the ADHD representation and the gay representation, and he writes fanfic about his favorite real-life superhero. Meanwhile, everybody but him knows that his best friend has a crush on him, and things get messy. This book I thought was so funny, it made me laugh out loud, and while I know that humor is a really subjective thing and it may or may not be your sense of humor, I thought it was super funny and totally reflective of like teen awkwardness at that age. Really enjoyed this one, and will definitely be reading more from TJ Klune in the future. In fact, 2 of his books this year made it on some of my favorites lists. The other one is in fantasy. Then coming in at number 11 is Network Effect by Martha Wells. This is the first full-length novel in the Murderbot Diaries, and as a series, I just love this so much. Murderbot is one of the best characters. They are a snarky AI who's hacked their governor module, and I just, like, these books are so good. If you haven't tried the Murderbot Diaries, do yourself a favor and try them. The other books are novellas. They're very short. They're easy to get through. Also, the audiobooks are phenomenal, and last I checked, they were available on Scribd, so you don't even have to read it with your eyes if you want to consume the content, but these make me laugh. They're fun. They're also a really good entry point if you're not sure where to start with science fiction. I would direct you at the Murderbot Diaries. I think they're just really great, and this was one of my favorite sci-fi books that I read this year. Number 10 on this list is one that I don't know why more people haven't been talking about it, because I thought it was so good. This is Unconquerable Sun by Kate Elliott. The pitch for this is it's a gender-flipped Alexander the Great in space, which is so cool and interesting, and after I got done reading it, actually in the middle of reading it, I started looking up Wikipedia articles about Alexander the Great, and it was really fun to see some of the crossover of like what things she pulled from real life history and paralleled in this space empire. This was fantastic. It's very fast paced. It like goes and does not stop, but probably my only critique of this book is that I wish we had a little more breathing room because it's got so much action, but I loved it. I can't wait for book 2, and I would definitely go back and reread this one. So if you haven't checked it out yet, I would highly recommend. Coming in at number 9 is A Memory Called Empire by Arkady Martine. I really loved this book. Even though it's not perfect, it has some pacing issues towards the end of it, and I didn't make it one of my favorite books of the year, but this is one of those books that has really stuck with me, and it's one that I have recommended to a lot of people and can't wait to continue with book 2 in 2021. This may not be everybody's kind of science fiction, but I was a huge fan of it. It's a lot to do with intrigue and courtly politics, and it's a little bit of a slow burn, very character driven. I would say maybe a little too slow burn near the later portion of the book. Like I said, it has some pacing issues, and it does, but it's really good, and that ending, it's got a great ending. Really strong ending. This is following a young woman who is a new diplomat from a small outpost in space, traveling for the first time to the planet that is the seat of this galactic empire, and she is getting involved in a lot of courtly politics and secrets. And what's interesting is there's a big focus here on language and the usage of language for meaning, which I thought was really cool. I'm also impressed that this is a debut novel, and I can't wait to see what we get in the next book in the series. My 8th favorite sci-fi book of the year, and the only author that you are going to see on this list twice, was The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet by Becky Chambers. Oh my goodness, this was so good. What took me so long to read it? I really, really loved it. This reminds me a lot of the show Firefly, except more character driven and softer and a little more slow paced, which I don't mind. I get that that's not everybody's jam in terms of sci-fi. If you're looking for super fast paced, hard sci-fi that's more about like battles or plot rather than like hanging out with these lovely characters on this spaceship with their like random things that happen, you know, it may not be for everybody, but I loved it. I loved the world, I loved the characters, I loved the diversity that she brings to it. This was just so much fun and such a feel-good sci-fi book. Like, it just made me happy. So had to put this on this list. Really enjoyed it a lot and hope to continue on with that series next year. Number 7 is another one that's a little controversial, like people kind of love it or hate it. That's The Calculating Stars by Mary Robinette Kowal. This was so interesting to me, and I do think if you go into this expecting a lot of space stuff, like actually being in space, you're going to be disappointed because that's just not what this book does. But this is alternate history America during the space race, assuming this apocalyptic event happened. And it's another one that's really focused on the characters, and it's dealing with real issues that existed in the United States during that time, during the space race, in terms of misogyny and racism, and that plays a role in what happens here. But I loved this book so much. I loved the ideas it was playing with. I loved the story. This is one that I would definitely recommend for people who enjoy nonfiction book like The Astronaut's Wives Club or Hidden Figures. This has a lot in common with those books, even though they're nonfiction and this is fiction. It's got a very similar vibe, but I was a huge fan and this was one of my favorite sci-fi books I read this year. Then at number 6 is a Tor.com novella. I just love Tor.com for sci-fi and fantasy. They just kill it so much of the time. This is Riot Baby by Tochi Onyebuchi. It is his first adult work that had been published. I'd read one of his YA books previously and it wasn't necessarily my favorite thing, but this I loved. It's intense, it's hard-hitting, it's near future sci-fi with a brother and sister who have kind of mental powers, but this book is really dealing with things like institutional racism and the need for reform of the criminal justice system and more hard-hitting topics. So even though it's a short book, I had to take a break halfway through it because it got pretty intense, but I loved it. I thought it was beautifully written and hard-hitting and just so well executed for the project that it was. Definitely my 6th favorite sci-fi book that I read this year. And with that, we are getting into my top 5 of the year, which is super exciting. My 5th favorite was another YA sci-fi. This is the first book in a duology, and book 2 is coming out in 2021. This is Goddess in the Machine by Laura Beth Johnson. I thought this was so good and I am bummed that it didn't get more attention because I thought it was fantastic. I think the difficulty with this might have been the way that it was pitched. It may have been pitched a little more towards fantasy readers than sci-fi, and I'm not sure that works as well. The basic concept behind this is it follows a teen girl who is supposed to be traveling to a colony on another world with her family and is put into cryogenic suspension for 100 years. But when she wakes up, it's 1,000 years later. Things are completely different. Everybody she knew is gone, and society's understanding of technology has degraded to the point that they view technology more as magic, and they think that she is a goddess. So I thought this was really interesting in terms of looking at the way that, number one, language can change over time, because she creates this, I didn't think it was that hard to follow, but some people really didn't like it. I thought it was fun and immersive, but she creates this dialect of English, imagining how the language might evolve over the course of 1,000 years that people speak when the girl wakes up. There's, you know, like some typical YA tropes, but a lot of twists and turns, big revelations that I did not see coming, like several of them, like oh my god, what? moments that were so good. And like the ending, I mean, but it wasn't even the ending, it was like bam, 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 like multiple big twists. I thought it was so great, and I really liked the world. I thought it was interesting too, the way that it was playing with this idea of what happens when society regresses and no longer understands technology and views it as magic. She's not the only person to do things like this. In fact, Mark Lawrence's series that starts with Red Sister, that whole series is fantasy, but it's actually sci-fi because it's set in a world post-technology where things have regressed. And I always think that's a really interesting thing to consider. If you think that that's not realistic, it actually is, which is interesting. There is a thing that we had called the Dark Ages, where, you know, in ancient Rome, they had things like indoor plumbing and other types of technology that we forgot how to use. And then we had the medieval era where all of that was lost. So there is definitely reference points for things like this happening. So I really loved this, one of my favorite sci-fi books of the year, and I wish more people would give it a try. I don't love the covers, which is part of why I'm waiting till it comes out in paperback to buy it, because I guys, like, YA sci-fi people need to learn how to make better covers, because I don't think they're great, but it's a really good book. So check it out if you haven't yet. Number 4 is one that you could call sci-fi or fantasy. I'm putting it in the sci-fi category, but I think there's an argument to be made either direction. That is The City We Became by N.K. Jemisin. I really loved this a lot. I live in New York City, have for about 4.5 years, and this is definitely the kind of book where the more familiar you are with New York City, the more you're going to get out of it. But if you know New York at all, you will know it's so smart. Like, she just nails the issues of the city, the identity of the different boroughs, and I also think that the project of this book is really interesting. It is subverting the racist and misogynistic things found in Lovecraft's work and is co-opting Lovecraftian tropes in a book that is celebrating diversity and addressing issues like homophobia, racism, gentrification, and things like that. This is definitely the most overtly political of N.K. Jemisin's books to date. All of her books are pretty political, but like, in the other ones, because they're in other worlds, you maybe could ignore that if you wanted to, whereas with this, because it's set in modern day New York City, like, you can't really ignore it. But I really loved it. Again, it's kind of a sci-fi fantasy hybrid, but has quite a bit of sci-fi elements to it, which is why I'm putting it here. I thought it was phenomenal, definitely a fan, and I generally love N.K. Jemisin's work. My third favorite sci-fi book of the year is another one that I think has been underhyped. I wish more people would talk about this. I didn't see a lot of people talk about it when it came out, and I thought it was fantastic. It is the first adult title from this author, and that is Chosen Ones by Veronica Roth. She's known as the author of the Divergent series, but this is very, very different in some ways. I loved it. Like, this, I just like ate this whole thing up. I thought the premise of it was so interesting, and I loved the main character. That said, I have to tell you, I am a fan of prickly, grumpy female characters. I really enjoy them, and that is what you get here. Plus, I thought the concept was really interesting. It follows a woman who was, as a teenager, one of a group of people who were prophesied chosen ones, co-opted by the government to develop their secret powers to defeat this, like, evil dude, right? So this happened when they were teenagers. Now it's set 10 years later, and all of them are dealing with PTSD and anxiety and various issues because of the trauma they experienced during that time, when all of a sudden things start to go wrong again. And at some point in this book, there is a big switch where I can't really talk much about it because it's super spoilery, but something happens and the tone and some elements of the story change pretty dramatically, and that may or may not work for you. I loved it. I loved pre-switch and post-switch, I guess we could say, but some people weren't so much fans of this, but I was a huge fan of this. I really liked where it went, and I'm bummed that, like, more people haven't read it and talked about it, because I thought it was fantastic. Then coming in at number 2 is another interesting one that I think kind of blurs boundaries in terms of genres. That is Fledgling by Octavia Butler. I read this year. It's a very controversial book, but I was a huge fan of it. I thought it was so smart and interesting and thought-provoking, and one that I would love to read again in the future and take notes in. This is Octavia Butler's version of a vampire story, but it's so much more than that. And in terms of, like, genre, it's kind of crossing lines between sci-fi / ethnography with murder mystery and courtroom drama. Like, it's a really interesting genre blend, but I was a fan of it, and it's using this vampire story as a way of interrogating things like race and gender and family structure and the expectations that we have surrounding those things. I thought it was really fantastic and I loved it. This is my second favorite sci-fi-ish book that I read in 2020. And finally, my number one favorite sci-fi book that I read this year might come as a surprise to people, and I do feel like this is a very personal thing, but it is a book that left such a strong, lasting impression on me, and I loved it a lot, and it hit me really hard emotionally. This is To Be Taught If Fortunate by Becky Chambers. So this is a novella. It's not very long, but man, did it hit home. And I have to say, I think part of it is the fact that I grew up on Star Trek. My mom was a big fan of Star Trek, so I grew up watching a lot of Next Generation, a lot of Voyager, and some of the original series. Yes, I saw the movies as well, but like I really grew up on the show. And I feel like this book really embodies the ethos of Star Trek, and like it made me so emotional. And the ethos of it is really exploration of the universe without leaving a big footprint or without colonizing other places. And that's a lot of the ethos that happens here. It follows a woman who is part of a small scientific team set out on this voyage where they're going to go and visit all of these different planets and investigate things scientifically and take samples, but it is really with the intention of affecting where they visit as little as possible and learning from what they find. Also, not everybody likes the ending of this. I did. It really worked for me. This is one of like 2 or 3 books I read this year that made me cry. Because I rarely do in books, but I really loved this. It struck a chord with me and became one of my favorite books. So favorite sci-fi pick of the year is To Be Taught If Fortunate by Becky Chambers. So there you go. Those are my 12 favorite sci-fi books that I read in 2020. Not all of them came out in 2020. Some of them did, some of them didn't, but they're all books that I really, really loved a lot. Talk to me in the comments down below. Let me know any of your thoughts or feelings on any of the books that I talked about today. And for your question of the day, tell me about your favorite sci-fi book that you read this year. Why was it your favorite? What was it about that you really loved? I know that some people might have really different tastes in the type of subgenres they love in sci-fi, but this should give you a sampling of some of the things that I am really a fan of. And part of it for me is thematic content. Like, I am a big thematic reader, and I love speculative fiction that is able to use those speculative elements as a way of interrogating or talking about real world issues that affect us in everyday life. And I think you definitely see that reflected in some of my favorite books. So talk to me in the comments down below. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up, subscribe if you want to see more, and if you want to support the work of the channel, check out the Patreon linked down below. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.